It was a day like any other at the bustling international airport in your city. The air was thick with the hum of engines, hurried footsteps, and the occasional echo of a flight announcement reverberating through the sleek terminals. Travelers of all kinds roamed the airport, families lugging suitcases, solo adventurers with earbuds tucked in, and business professionals clutching briefcases with an air of impatience. Among them was Susan, a sharply dressed woman in her mid-40s with a no-nonsense demeanor and a purpose in her stride. For Susan, today was monumental. A make-or-break meeting awaited her on the other side of her flight. She had spent months preparing for this opportunity, and now every second mattered. The first-class lounge was a haven of quiet luxury amidst the chaos. Plush seats, an endless buffet, and a bar staffed by an impeccably dressed bartender set the tone for exclusivity. Susan found herself there, clutching a cup of coffee she barely sipped. She was too busy checking her emails, mentally rehearsing her pitch for the umpteenth time. She was on edge but composed. Years of working her way up the corporate ladder had taught her that projecting confidence was key, even when nerves threatened to unravel her. Across the lounge, another figure commanded attention. Big Shaq, the internationally renowned rapper and entertainer, had entered with his entourage. His booming laugh and unmistakable presence turned heads instantly. Even those who pretended not to notice couldn't resist sneaking a glance at the star. Dressed in a designer tracksuit and dripping in gold chains, he was the epitome of charisma. To many in the lounge, he was a living legend, a larger-than-life figure who had dominated charts and headlines for years. But to Susan, he was just another passenger. She noticed him briefly, her gaze flickering over to the commotion as fans whispered and giggled. But Susan's focus returned to her laptop screen. There wasn't time to be starstruck, her career-defining moment was just hours away. She had paid for her first-class seat not for luxury but for necessity. A quiet space to work, a comfortable seat to catch a quick nap, and the guarantee of a stress-free flight were all part of her plan. Nothing could go wrong today, not if she wanted to secure the deal of a lifetime. As boarding was announced, Susan gathered her belongings and made her way to the gate. First-class passengers were invited to board first, as always, and she found herself in line near the front. Behind her, she heard the unmistakable voice of Big Shaq. He was cracking jokes with his entourage, his deep laugh rolling through the air like thunder. His energy was magnetic, and people around him seemed drawn to it like moths to a flame. But Susan wasn't one of them. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, focusing on the gate agents scanning boarding passes. Then it happened. Big Shaq and his crew approached the line, bypassing the waiting passengers. With a casual confidence that bordered on entitlement, he nodded at the gate agent, expecting to be let through immediately. The young woman scanning tickets hesitated, glancing nervously at the passengers in line. Susan could feel the tension build. She was third in line now, and the idea of someone cutting ahead, celebrity or not, didn't sit well with her. Not today. Not when every second counted. "Excuse me," Susan said, her voice clear and firm. Heads turned as her words cut through the low murmur of conversation. Big Shaq paused mid-stride, his signature grin faltering slightly as he turned to face her. "Yeah," he said, his tone a mix of curiosity and challenge. "You can't just skip the line," Susan continued, her posture straight and her voice unwavering. "We're all waiting here." The lounge fell silent. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that signaled something unexpected was unfolding. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock, amusement, and curiosity. A few pulled out their phones, sensing that this moment might be one for the books. Big Shaq raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. It wasn't often that someone confronted him so directly. "I'm in first class," he said, his tone still light but with a hint of incredulity. "I thought I could board now." "So am I," Susan replied, lifting her boarding pass slightly as if to emphasize her point. "And there's a line for a reason." The tension was palpable now. Even the gate agent looked unsure of how to proceed. Big Shaq's entourage shifted uncomfortably, their usual bravado muted by the unexpected confrontation. For a moment, it seemed as though Shaq might push back, his pride demanding it. But then he smiled, a wide, disarming grin that had charmed millions. All right, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. You've got me. I'll wait. A ripple of laughter and applause spread through the lounge. Some clapped out of admiration for Susan's courage, others out of amusement at seeing a celebrity momentarily humbled. Susan allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as she turned back toward the gate. The agent scanned her boarding pass, and she stepped onto the jet bridge, leaving the scene behind her. But as she settled into her seat, her heart was pounding. The confrontation had been impulsive, a split-second decision driven by the stress of the day. She had no way of knowing how this moment would ripple outward, how it would impact not just her flight but the lives of everyone on board. She certainly didn't know it would become the story of the day, shared across social media and news outlets before the plane even landed. As the plane began to board, Susan couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Pride at standing her ground. Anxiety over how Big Shaq might react. And a growing curiosity about what lay ahead. Little did she know, this flight would not be as uneventful as she had hoped. And her decision to speak up would lead to consequences she could never have anticipated, for herself, for Big Shaq, and for everyone watching from the sidelines. For now, though, she closed her eyes and tried to relax, unaware that the day's drama was far from over. The tension in the first-class cabin was almost tangible as the last passengers settled into their seats. The attendants moved efficiently, stowing luggage and offering pre-flight beverages, their smiles calm and professional despite the energy in the air. Susan tried to focus on her laptop, her fingers poised over the keyboard, but her mind kept drifting back to the scene at the gate. The moment replayed in her head, her voice cutting through the murmur, Big Shaq's expression shifting from surprise to acceptance, and the scattered applause that followed. She had stood her ground, yes, but now she wondered if it had been worth it. Across the aisle, Big Shaq reclined in his seat, his signature charisma dialed down a notch. He was uncharacteristically quiet, sipping his drink and scrolling through his phone. His entourage had been seated in the rows behind him, their chatter low and subdued. It was clear that the earlier confrontation had left its mark on everyone. Susan couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not in a malicious way, but as if she were the unexpected star of a drama that had yet to fully unfold. Susan had spent years mastering the art of composure. Her role as a corporate strategist demanded it. She was the one who walked into boardrooms full of skeptical executives and turned their doubts into deals. She thrived under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't about strategy or negotiation. This was personal, and the weight of it pressed heavily on her. Still, she forced herself to appear unfazed, focusing on her screen as if nothing had happened. The flight attendant approached her with a warm smile, offering a refill of champagne. Susan declined, opting for water instead. "Big meeting?" the attendant asked conversationally, noticing her laptop and the intensity in her expression. "Something like that," Susan replied, her tone polite but curt. She wasn't in the mood for small talk. Meanwhile, Big Shaq leaned over to his attendant, gesturing subtly in Susan's direction. He whispered something that made the attendant glance her way before nodding and retreating toward the galley. Susan noticed the exchange out of the corner of her eye, her curiosity piqued but her resolve to ignore it stronger. She wasn't here to engage in a battle of egos, she was here to work, to succeed, to make this flight count. The plane began to taxi, and the hum of engines filled the cabin. Susan closed her laptop, bracing for takeoff. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, she felt a sense of relief. At least now, the chaotic world of the airport was behind her. She had 3 hours of uninterrupted time to prepare for her presentation, and she intended to make the most of it. But just as she began to relax, a tap on her shoulder startled her. She turned to find Big Shaq standing there, towering over her with an expression that was surprisingly unreadable. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by something more subdued. "Mind if I sit here for a minute?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. Susan blinked, caught off guard. She hesitated, then nodded. "Sure," she said, though her tone carried a hint of wariness. Big Shaq settled into the seat, his large frame making the already spacious first-class chair seem smaller. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and let out a sigh. "Look," he began, his voice lower and more serious than she expected. "I just wanted to say, you've got guts. Not many people would have called me out like that." Susan tilted her head, studying him. Was this an olive branch or something else entirely? "I wasn't trying to make a scene," she said carefully. "I just think rules are rules, no matter who you are." He nodded, his lips quirking into a faint smile. "Fair enough. But you gotta admit, it's not every day someone like me gets told off by someone like you." Susan raised an eyebrow. "Someone like me?" "You know what I mean," he said quickly, holding up his hands. "You're no nonsense, straight shooter. I respect that. Most people just want a selfie or a handshake." She couldn't help but smirk at that. "Well, I'm not most people." "Clearly," he said, leaning back with a chuckle. For a moment, the tension eased, and they sat in a strange, tentative truce. But before the conversation could continue, the plane hit a sudden patch of turbulence. The cabin lights flickered, and a collective gasp rippled through the passengers. Susan gripped the armrests, her heart racing as the plane shuddered. The turbulence passed quickly, but the unease lingered. Big Shaq straightened in his seat, his playful demeanor replaced by a look of concern. "You okay?" he asked, glancing at Susan. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. She wasn't afraid of flying, but moments like these always reminded her of how fragile everything could be. The captain's voice came over the intercom, reassuring everyone that the turbulence was nothing to worry about. But as the flight attendants moved through the cabin to check on passengers, Susan noticed something unusual. One of the attendants was speaking urgently into a phone, her expression tense. A sense of foreboding settled over Susan, though she couldn't quite explain why. Moments later, the head flight attendant addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency on board," she announced. "If there is a doctor or medical professional among the passengers, please press your call button immediately." The cabin fell silent, save for the murmurs of concern. Susan looked around, hoping someone would respond, but no call buttons lit up. The attendant repeated the request, her tone more urgent this time. Big Shaq turned to Susan, his brow furrowed. "You think we've got a doctor on board?" "I hope so," Susan replied, her stomach tightening. She wasn't a doctor, but she had taken advanced first aid courses during her time volunteering with disaster relief efforts. It had been years since she'd used those skills, but the knowledge was still there, buried under layers of routine and corporate life. Without thinking, she pressed her call button. The flight attendant was at her side in an instant. "Are you a doctor?" she asked, her eyes filled with hope. "No," Susan admitted, "but I have first aid training." "What's the situation?" The attendant explained quickly. A passenger in the economy cabin was experiencing severe chest pains and difficulty breathing. There were no doctors on board, and the nearest airport was over an hour away. Susan's mind raced, adrenaline surging as she processed the information. This wasn't part of the plan. She was supposed to be preparing for her meeting, not stepping into a life-or-death situation. But she couldn't ignore the call for help. "I'll do what I can," she said, unbuckling her seatbelt. Big Shaq stood as well. "I'll come with you," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Susan glanced at him, surprised. "Do you have medical training?" "No," he admitted, "but I can follow instructions. And I'm good at keeping people calm." She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Together, they followed the flight attendant to the economy cabin, where a middle-aged man was slumped in his seat, clutching his chest and gasping for air. His wife sat beside him, her face pale with fear. Susan knelt beside the man, assessing his condition as her training kicked in. She issued instructions to the flight attendant and to Big Shack, who held the man steady and spoke to him in soothing tones. The cabin buzzed with whispered speculation as passengers watched the scene unfold. For the next hour, Susan worked tirelessly, her focus unwavering. She administered oxygen, monitored the man's pulse, and prepared for the possibility of CPR. Big Shack proved to be an invaluable assistant, his calm presence and strength providing support in ways Susan hadn't anticipated. When the plane finally landed at the nearest airport for an emergency medical evacuation, the man was stable, thanks to Susan's quick thinking and Big Shack's steady assistance. As paramedics boarded to take over, the passengers erupted into applause, their gratitude palpable. Back in the first-class cabin, Susan sank into her seat, exhausted but relieved. Big Shack sat beside her, his expression one of genuine admiration. "You're something else," he said quietly. "So are you," she replied, surprising herself with the sincerity in her voice. For the first time, Susan realized that today had been about more than just a meeting or a confrontation. It had been a reminder of what truly mattered: human connection, courage, and the ability to rise to the occasion, no matter the circumstances. And in that moment, as the plane prepared to resume its journey, Susan knew her life would never be the same. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane resumed its journey, leaving behind the commotion of the emergency landing. Susan sat back in her seat, her mind racing through the events of the past hour. The adrenaline that had carried her through the crisis was ebbing, replaced by a profound exhaustion and an undercurrent of disbelief. She had walked onto this plane thinking of nothing but her presentation, yet here she was, having stepped into a situation far beyond the confines of her professional life. Beside her, Big Shack leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. For the first time since boarding, he seemed subdued. The energy that had radiated from him earlier in the lounge was gone, replaced by a quiet thoughtfulness. Every now and then, he would glance at Susan, as if he were about to say something, but the words never came. The passengers had returned to their routines, some reading, others napping or scrolling through their phones, but the air in the cabin felt different now. There was a collective sense of gratitude and respect, a quiet acknowledgement of what Susan had done. A few passengers had stopped by her seat to thank her personally, their words heartfelt and sincere. It was strange for Susan, who was used to recognition in boardrooms and meeting halls, to be thanked by strangers for something so fundamentally human. The flight attendants approached with renewed politeness, offering Susan and Big Shack refreshments and anything else they might need. It was clear they too recognized the gravity of what had just occurred. One attendant even slipped Susan a handwritten note of thanks, her handwriting neat and precise, expressing how much her actions had meant to the crew and passengers alike. Susan accepted the kindness with a small smile, though inside she felt an odd mix of pride and discomfort. She hadn't stepped in for recognition or accolades. She had acted because she couldn't imagine doing otherwise. Still, the gratitude felt good, a balm to the stress that had accompanied her every step onto the plane. "I get it," he said. "But don't let it overshadow what just happened. You did something incredible today. Don't forget that." Susan nodded, his words resonating in a way she hadn't expected. "Thanks," she said simply. As the plane began its descent, the cabin buzzed with renewed energy. Passengers gathered their belongings, chatted with their seatmates, and prepared for the final leg of their journeys. Susan packed up her laptop, her mind clearer than it had been in days. She felt ready, not just for her meeting, but for whatever else the day might bring. When the plane touched down, there was a brief pause before the passengers erupted into applause. It was a tradition on many flights, but this time it felt different, more heartfelt, more meaningful. Susan felt a lump rise in her throat as she joined in, clapping not just for the safe landing but for the journey that had brought her here. As they disembarked, Big Shaq lingered beside her, his usual entourage hanging back to give him space. "Listen," he said, his tone serious. "I don't know what's waiting for you on the other side of this flight, but I hope you crush it. You deserve to." Susan smiled, genuinely touched. "Thanks. And, thank you for stepping in back there. I couldn't have done it alone." He grinned, his trademark charisma shining through once more. "You didn't need me, but I'm glad I was there." They parted ways at the gate, each heading toward their respective destinations. Susan watched him go, a curious mix of admiration and gratitude filling her chest. She had started the day thinking of Big Shaq as just another celebrity, larger than life, untouchable, and distant. But now she saw him for what he really was, a person, just like her, navigating the unpredictable twists of life. As she stepped into the terminal, the weight of the day's events settled over her. It had been a day of unexpected challenges and unplanned detours, but it had also been a day of growth and connection. And as she made her way toward her meeting, she couldn't help but feel a quiet confidence. She had faced the unexpected and come out stronger. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready. The terminal was a whirlwind of motion as passengers streamed off the plane, a chaotic yet familiar scene of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and the occasional joyful reunion. Susan stepped into the bright, bustling concourse with her carry-on in hand, her mind still reeling from the events of the flight. For a brief moment, she stood still, allowing the energy of the crowd to wash over her. It was a stark contrast to the quiet intensity she had felt in the first-class cabin just hours earlier. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Texts from colleagues checking on her progress, reminders about the meeting, and even a few messages from fellow passengers who had tracked her down on social media to thank her for her actions. She skimmed through them quickly, her lips curling into a small smile at the words of gratitude. But one message stood out, a simple "thank you" from Big Shaq himself, followed by a picture of him standing outside the terminal with his trademark grin and a thumbs up. Susan chuckled softly, shaking her head. It was surreal to think that just a few hours ago, she and the celebrity had been at odds over something as mundane as boarding priority. Now, they shared a connection forged in a moment of crisis, a bond that transcended the artificial boundaries of status and celebrity. But there was no time to linger on those thoughts. She had a meeting to get to, and the stakes were high. Susan had worked tirelessly for months on this project, pouring every ounce of her expertise and determination into crafting a proposal that could change the trajectory of her career. She had rehearsed her pitch in front of mirrors, friends, and even her skeptical cat, refining every word and anticipating every question. This was her moment, and despite the exhaustion tugging at her, she was determined to seize it. Navigating through the terminal, Susan made her way to the exit where a car service was waiting to whisk her to the downtown office building where her meeting would take place. The ride was quiet, the hum of the engine providing a soothing backdrop as she mentally reviewed her presentation one last time. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the flight, to the man whose life she had helped save, to the overwhelming applause from the passengers, and to the unexpected partnership with Big Shaq. It was a reminder of how unpredictable life could be, how the most ordinary days could turn extraordinary in an instant. When the car pulled up in front of the sleek glass tower, Susan took a deep breath. This was it. The culmination of months of effort, sacrifice, and sleepless nights. She straightened her blazer, smoothed her hair, and stepped out of the car with her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. The lobby was bustling with activity, a sea of professionals moving with purpose, their conversations a steady hum against the backdrop of polished marble and stainless steel. Susan checked in at the front desk and was promptly escorted to the executive floor, where the meeting room awaited. The walk down the corridor felt endless, each step echoing in her ears. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she pushed the nerves aside, reminding herself of everything she had accomplished today. If she could handle a mid-flight medical emergency and hold her ground with a global celebrity, she could certainly handle a boardroom full of executives. The meeting room was a pristine, intimidating space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. A long mahogany table dominated the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. The executives were already seated, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism as they turned to greet her. Susan smiled confidently, extending her hand to each of them as she introduced herself. The presentation began smoothly. Susan moved through her slides with practiced ease, her voice steady and persuasive. She outlined her proposal with precision, addressing potential challenges and providing well-researched solutions. The executives leaned in, their interest growing with each passing minute. Susan could feel the momentum building, a surge of confidence propelling her forward. But then, halfway through her presentation, an unexpected question threw her off balance. One of the senior executives, a sharp-eyed man with a reputation for being notoriously difficult to impress, challenged a key aspect of her proposal. His tone was firm, his words laced with skepticism. The room fell silent as everyone turned to Susan, waiting to see how she would respond. For a moment, her mind went blank. Panic threatened to take hold, but then she thought of the flight, of the moment she had stepped forward to help a stranger in need, of the applause that had followed, and of the realization that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. Drawing on that inner strength, she took a deep breath and responded with calm confidence, addressing the executive's concerns head-on and backing up her points with data and real-world examples. Her answer seemed to satisfy him, and the tension in the room eased. The rest of the presentation continued without a hitch, and by the time she reached her final slide, Susan could tell she had won them over. The executives nodded approvingly, their expressions warm and engaged. When she finished, they broke into applause, a sound that felt as sweet as it had on the plane. The lead executive stood and extended his hand. "Impressive work, Susan," he said. "We're excited about the potential of your proposal and look forward to moving forward with it." Relief and pride washed over her as she shook his hand, the weight of months of hard work lifting from her shoulders. She had done it. Against all odds, she had seized the moment and made it her own. As she left the building, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the city, Susan felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The day had been nothing like she had planned, yet it had unfolded in ways she could never have anticipated. She had been tested in ways that went far beyond her career, and she had emerged stronger, more confident, and more determined than ever. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen to see another message from Big Shaq. This one was a selfie of him holding up a newspaper with a headline about the in-flight emergency. The caption read, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear blazers. Respect, Susan." She laughed, shaking her head, and typed a quick reply, "Right back at you, Shaq." As she walked down the busy city street, the noise and energy swirling around her, Susan couldn't help but smile. The day had started with a confrontation, taken a detour into crisis, and ended with triumph. It was a reminder that life was full of unexpected twists and turns, and sometimes, the best thing you could do was embrace the chaos and rise to the occasion. Someone who's a real hero. On our flight today, we had a medical emergency, and this amazing woman, Susan, stepped up and saved the day. No cameras, no press, just pure heart. So, wherever you are, give her some love, because she's the real MVP. The video had already garnered thousands of likes and comments, with people from around the world chiming in to celebrate Susan's actions. She smiled, shaking her head in disbelief. The day just kept getting stranger and more surreal, but in the best way possible. As she continued walking, her phone rang. It was her boss, Martin, calling to congratulate her on the successful presentation. "Susan, you nailed it," he said, his voice practically bursting with enthusiasm. The executives were blown away. "They're ready to move forward, and they've already mentioned how impressed they were with your professionalism and composure. You've set a new bar for all of us." "Thanks, Martin," she replied, her tone modest despite the warmth spreading through her chest. "It was a team effort." "Don't sell yourself short," Martin said. "But hey, I also heard about what happened on the flight. It's all over social media. I had no idea you had that kind of training. You're a hero, Susan. Plain and simple. Hero." The word felt strange to her, almost too grand for what she had done. She had simply acted in the moment, doing what she could to help someone in need. Yet hearing it from her boss, from Big Shaq, from strangers on the internet, it made her realize that perhaps heroism wasn't about grandeur. It was about stepping up when it mattered most. After the call, Susan found a quiet cafe and settled into a corner booth with a cup of tea. She opened her laptop, intending to catch up on work, but her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Instead, she found herself writing down her thoughts about the day, capturing the emotions and lessons while they were still fresh. She reflected on the unexpected ways her path had crossed with Big Shaq's. In the lounge, he had been just another celebrity, a figure larger than life but seemingly untouchable. On the plane, he had shown a depth of character and humanity that defied her initial assumptions. He had stood beside her, offering support and strength in a moment of crisis. And now, through his social media posts, he was using his platform to amplify her actions, turning a private act of service into a public celebration of compassion. Susan's thoughts turned to the passenger whose life she had helped save. She didn't even know his name, but she hoped he was recovering well. She wondered how his family had felt when they got the call, how his wife had managed to stay calm in the chaos of the moment. It was a reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could change. And yet, it was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the way strangers could come together in moments of need. The cafe began to fill up as the evening crowd trickled in. Susan glanced at her watch, realizing it was time to head back to her hotel. She packed up her things and stepped outside, the cool night air refreshing against her skin. As she walked, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The day had been filled with challenges and surprises, but it had also been filled with purpose. When she reached her hotel, the concierge greeted her with a knowing smile. "Ms. Harper, I believe this is for you," he said, handing her an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from Big Shaq. It read, "Susan. Today reminded me that fame doesn't make you special, what you do with your life does. You showed all of us what it means to be brave, selfless, and real. Keep being you, and don't forget, you're the boss of more than just boardrooms. Shaq ****. Susan felt a lump rise in her throat as she read the note. She hadn't expected this, hadn't realized how deeply the day had impacted not just her but those around her. Folding the note carefully, she placed it in her bag, a keepsake from a day that had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. As she settled into her hotel room, Susan stared out the window at the glittering city lights. The world outside seemed both vast and intimate, a place filled with endless possibilities and connections waiting to be made. She thought about the meeting, the flight, the people she had met and helped. And she thought about the future, how this day would shape her choices, her perspective, and her sense of what truly mattered. With a deep breath, Susan turned off the lights and lay down, a contented smile on her face. The day had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it had also shown her something profound, that in the most unexpected moments, extraordinary things could happen. And in those moments, she had the power to rise, to act, and to make a difference. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the hotel curtains, waking Susan with a gentle warmth. She stretched lazily, the tension of the previous day slowly fading from her body as she processed where she was and everything that had happened. For a fleeting moment, she thought it might have been a dream, her confrontation with Big Shaq, the in-flight emergency, the meeting. But the buzz of her phone on the bedside table brought reality rushing back. She picked it up to find a barrage of new notifications. Her social media accounts were still alive with messages of gratitude, admiration, and even curiosity. News outlets had picked up the story, piecing together posts from passengers and the airline statement. Headlines like "Ordinary Woman Becomes Hero Mid-Flight" and "Celebrity and Stranger Join Forces to Save a Life" splashed across her screen, accompanied by photos of her and Big Shaq standing in the aisle of the plane, tending to the distressed passenger. Susan shook her head with a bemused smile. She had gone viral, and she wasn't sure how she felt about it. Part of her cringed at the attention. She was someone who thrived in quiet competence, not the spotlight. Yet another part of her, the part that had experienced firsthand how people could rally around a moment of humanity, felt a quiet sense of pride. If her story inspired others to act with courage and kindness, wasn't that worth it? After showering and dressing, Susan headed down to the hotel lobby for breakfast. The restaurant was bustling with guests, but as she walked in, she noticed several heads turning in her direction. A few people whispered to each other, pointing subtly at her. She tried to ignore it and found a quiet corner table, ordering her usual coffee and eggs. As she sipped her coffee, a man approached her table, his face hesitant but kind. "Excuse me," he said softly. "You're Susan Harper, aren't you?" She looked up, momentarily startled. "Yes, that's me." "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I read about what happened on the flight. My wife had a similar medical emergency a few years ago, and no one stepped up to help. What you did, it meant something, not just to that man but to people like me who know how terrifying those moments can be." Susan felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't considered how far the ripples of her actions might extend. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "I'm just glad I was able to help." The man nodded and left her table, and Susan sat back in her chair, her mind churning. This was more than she had anticipated, more than she had thought possible. It was humbling, and it reminded her of something she hadn't allowed herself to consider in years, that her actions, no matter how small they seemed at the time, had the power to make a difference. Her reverie was interrupted by another buzz from her phone. This time, it was an unexpected message from the airline's CEO. "Dear Ms. Harper, on behalf of everyone at our airline, I want to personally thank you for your incredible actions during yesterday's flight. Your quick thinking and bravery saved a life, and we are profoundly grateful. As a token of our appreciation, we would like to offer you complimentary first-class tickets for a year. Additionally, we'd love to discuss collaborating with you on an initiative to promote first aid training for passengers and crew. Please let us know if you'd be interested. Warm regards. CEO's name." Susan stared at the message, her mind reeling. First-class tickets for a year? A partnership with the airline? It was surreal. She had never imagined her actions would lead to something like this. Yet the idea of working on an initiative to promote first aid training intrigued her. It was a chance to turn her experience into something meaningful, something that could benefit others on a much larger scale. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video call request from Big Shaq. She hesitated for a moment, then answered. His face filled the screen, his ever-present grin lighting up the frame. "Hey, superstar," he said, his voice full of warmth. "How's it feel to be the hero of the day?" Susan rolled her eyes playfully. "I think you're exaggerating." "Not at all," he said, leaning closer to the camera. "I've been reading the comments, the articles, people love you. And they should. What you did was incredible." "Well, you weren't too bad yourself," she admitted. "I couldn't have done it without you." He laughed, his voice booming. Teamwork makes the dream work, right? Speaking of which, I had an idea. What if we did something together? A charity event or fundraiser? We could use this momentum to make a real difference. Susan was taken aback. The idea was bold, but it had merit. What kind of event? She asked, curiosity piqued. I was thinking something fun but meaningful, he said. Maybe a concert where part of the proceeds go to first aid training programs or medical supplies for underserved communities. I've got the connections, and you've got the story. Together, we'd be unstoppable. Susan considered his words, her mind racing with possibilities. It was ambitious, but it felt right. Her experience on the flight had shown her the importance of being prepared, and the chance to amplify that message alongside someone like Big Shaq was too good to pass up. I'm in, she said, a smile spreading across her face. Let's do it. Now that's what I'm talking about, he exclaimed, pumping his fist. I'll have my team reach out to yours, and we'll start planning. This is gonna be epic. As the call ended, Susan sat back in her chair, a sense of excitement bubbling inside her. The day before had been filled with unexpected twists, but now those twists were leading to something even bigger, a chance to create change, to inspire others, and to make the world just a little bit better. Over the next few weeks, Susan and Big Shaq worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. The concert was announced with much fanfare, and tickets sold out within hours. The event became a rallying point for a movement, drawing attention to the importance of first aid training and the power of ordinary people stepping up in extraordinary moments. When the day of the concert arrived, Susan stood backstage, looking out at the sea of faces in the crowd. The energy was electric, and the atmosphere was one of hope and unity. As Big Shaq took the stage, the audience erupted in cheers, their enthusiasm contagious. When he introduced Susan, the applause was deafening. She stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding but her resolve steady. Standing in front of thousands of people, she shared her story, not as a hero, but as someone who had simply acted when it mattered most. Her words resonated deeply, and by the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. That night, as the final notes of the concert echoed through the venue, Susan felt a profound sense of fulfillment. What had started as an ordinary flight had become a catalyst for something extraordinary. It had changed her life, brought her unexpected friendships, and given her a platform to make a difference. As she walked off the stage, Big Shaq greeted her with a high five and a grin. Told you we'd be unstoppable, he said. Susan laughed, her heart full. You were right, she admitted. And as they looked out at the crowd, cheering, clapping, and united in purpose, Susan knew that this was just the beginning of something truly remarkable.